August 1944, somewhere in the Arizona desert, the sun hung low, pale and blistering over a vast expanse of wire and sand. A line of exhausted men, their khaki uniforms torn and caked with salt, shuffled forward under the gaze of American sentries. Dust clung to their faces. Eyes dark and hollow stared at nothing. They were Imperial Japanese soldiers, survivors of the Mariana Islands, captured alive against everything they'd been taught to believe possible. At the end of the line, they stopped. Before them stood a long wooden shed, pipes overhead, steam faintly rising from within. Buckets, soap, towels, a sign in Japanese, hastily painted, bathing area. For a moment, silence, then murmurs, disbelief, suspicion. Some refused to enter, expecting poison gas. Others trembled, staring at the American guards who simply motioned them forward, saying nothing. When the first man stepped beneath the warm water, the sound of falling drops filled the shed like distant rain. Dirt ran off his skin, forming brown rivers that disappeared into the drain. For the first time since capture, the air smelled of soap, not death. And in that quiet, steaming moment, the war's most profound contrast revealed itself. By late 1941, the Pacific Ocean had become a map of ambition and defiance. The Empire of Japan, driven by resource hunger and imperial ideology, was expanding across East Asia at a pace that stunned the world. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning. It was the explosion of a strategy already long in motion. In Tokyo, the military elite preached a brutal creed born from Bushido, the ancient samurai code. It was not simply about fighting well, it was about dying properly. To be captured was the ultimate shame, an erasure of honor. A man who surrendered was no longer a soldier nor a son. His spirit was already dead. This belief saturated every corner of the Imperial Japanese Army. From the jungles of Burma to the volcanic ridges of Saipan, soldiers were taught that Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant torture and humiliation. Better to die by your own hand, officers told them, than live as a slave. So when Japan struck the Allies in 1941, its soldiers fought with suicidal resolve. The result was a war defined not only by violence but by the absence of mercy. In the Philippines, the Bataan Death March became the dark measure of that cruelty. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino POWs, stripped of food and water, were forced to march under the sun until their legs failed and their throats cracked. Bayonets ended the rest. On the other side of the ocean, Allied soldiers in Japanese prison camps perished from starvation, beatings, and tropical disease. Survival rates were less than 30%, one of the lowest in modern military history. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Out of fanatic loyalty or sheer terror, they fought until the last cartridge, the last heartbeat. Those who were captured, in a rare and unthinkable fate, often tried to take their own lives afterward. The Americans, studying this, came to a grim understanding. In this war, the enemy did not intend to survive. The U.S. military began preparing not only for combat, but for psychological warfare, a campaign to break through the code of death before it consumed millions more. But in doing so, they faced a moral dilemma. How do you fight an enemy that refuses to surrender? And what do you do with the few who do? By 1943, the first trickle of Japanese prisoners reached American hands. Many were wounded survivors from isolated islands, men too weak to die by their own grenades. They arrived frightened, expecting to be executed upon capture. Some begged for death. Others bowed in silence, refusing food, awaiting a bullet that never came. Instead, something unthinkable happened. They were treated, bandaged, and fed. American medics and the very men they'd been told were monsters cleaned their wounds, gave them water, even cigarettes. The prisoners could not comprehend it. To them, the world had turned upside down. For the United States, this was not just an act of compassion, it was policy. The U.S. had signed and intended to uphold the 1929 Geneva Convention, which outlined humane treatment for prisoners of war, rules the Japanese government had refused to ratify. To the American command, this adherence was strategic as well as moral. Every well-fed prisoner, every clean camp, was a silent statement to the world that democracy and decency could triumph over terror. But building this system was no small task. Thousands of prisoners would soon be captured as the Pacific tide turned. Camps would be needed, not in the jungles but on American soil, thousands of miles from the front. And so, across the United States and from Hawaii to California, Texas, Arizona, and even as far as Wisconsin, fences began to rise. Wooden barracks appeared in deserts and farmlands. Watchtowers stood under the sun. But these were not concentration camps. They were carefully organized military compounds with kitchens, medical tents, and yes, even showers. It was a choice that stunned both sides of the war, one born from law, logistics, and something deeper, a belief that even an enemy deserved dignity. By early 1944, as the Pacific War ground on, the balance had begun to shift. The Japanese Empire was losing islands faster than it could defend them. American air superiority was growing. Naval blockades were cutting supply lines, and garrisons across Micronesia and the Marianas were isolated, desperate, and starving. It was in this collapsing world that thousands of Japanese soldiers began to fall into Allied hands, not as willing prisoners, but as broken survivors of impossible battles. From the ashes of Tarawa, Saipan and Tinian, small groups of dazed men emerged. Hands raised, eyes hollow. Many were wounded, delirious, or emaciated. They expected the Americans to kill them. Some were so shocked to be offered water that they refused to drink, believing it must be poisoned. For the U.S. Army, these men were not trophies. They were a challenge, a test of principle in a war where the line between civilization and savagery was dangerously thin. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, OPMG, took charge of POW administration. Its directive was clear. Every prisoner, regardless of nationality, would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. This was more than bureaucratic obedience. It was psychological warfare. By showing mercy, America intended to expose the lies of imperial propaganda that painted Allied forces as barbaric. To the soldiers running these camps, the mission had two fronts: containment and conversion. Prisoners were to be securely held, but also shown a different way of life: order, discipline, and fairness. The first major Japanese POW facility on U.S. soil was Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, followed soon by Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, Camp Florence in Arizona, and several others scattered across the American heartland. These places were chosen for their remoteness, climate, and the ability to keep prisoners far from coastal escape routes. The contrast between these camps and the front lines could not have been greater. Instead of jungle rot and starvation, there were mess halls, infirmaries, classrooms, and most surprisingly, showers, a luxury nearly unknown to the average Japanese soldier. Many of these prisoners had gone months without washing, having lived in caves and trenches amid the rot of war. Their uniforms were infested with lice, their skin cracked with salt and grime. When they arrived and saw steam rising from a wooden barracks marked bath, it defied everything they believed about Americans. To them, cleanliness had moral weight. Purity of the body reflected purity of spirit. But here their captors, the supposed devils of Western propaganda, were offering that purity back to them. It was a small act with enormous psychological impact. American guards and camp staff, trained in the Geneva rules, enforced a strict standard: 3 meals a day, medical checks, male privileges, and recreational time. Even as the war raged on and hatred for Japan ran deep in the American public, within the wire, discipline was professional, not emotional. The government also saw an opportunity. By maintaining humane conditions, they could encourage surrender among Japanese troops still fighting abroad. Leaflets were dropped over Pacific Islands showing captured soldiers alive, clothed, and well-fed, undermining Tokyo's insistence that prisoners were slaughtered. For Washington, this was strategy wrapped in decency, propaganda through compassion. But not all Americans agreed. Across the U.S., newspapers printed stories of atrocities committed by Japanese forces in China and the Philippines. For many families who had lost sons in the Pacific, the idea that enemy soldiers were eating bread and taking showers under American care was infuriating. The military stood firm. "We are not them," said one officer at Camp McCoy. "If we abandon our principles, we lose more than the war." Behind the fences, Japanese prisoners watched their captors with growing confusion. They were guarded, certainly, but not abused. They were counted, disciplined, and given work. Over time, they saw that the Americans were not performing cruelty nor kindness, but routine. Order itself was mercy. Slowly, disbelief began to turn into reflection. The system was working, not only as containment but as quiet education. Soon, intelligence officers realized something remarkable. The more fairly Japanese POWs were treated, the more they talked. Fear gave way to cooperation. Prisoners began sharing details about units, equipment, and morale, not from torture, but from trust. By 1945, the United States had captured nearly 22,000 Japanese prisoners of war, a small number compared to Europe, but each one a profound psychological victory. Every shower, every clean uniform, every humane gesture chipped away at the wall of propaganda that Imperial Japan had built around its people. For centuries, Japan's warrior identity had been bound to the ideal of dying well. From samurai duels to modern battlefields, death in combat was not defeat. It was fulfillment. But for the men who found themselves captured in 1944, that identity shattered in an instant. In the minds of these soldiers, surrender erased everything. Family honor, ancestral pride, even humanity itself. When Japanese POWs first arrived at American camps, many refused to speak, eat, or look their captors in the eye. Some tried to starve themselves to death, believing it was the only way to restore dignity. Others wept in silence, overwhelmed by the dishonor of being alive. To their American guards, this behavior was baffling. These were not defiant enemies, but ghosts. Men destroyed not by bullets, but by shame. They bowed mechanically, moved without resistance, and avoided mirrors. Psychologists who later observed them described an identity collapse, soldiers who no longer knew who they were. And yet, over time, the smallest human acts began to rebuild them. A warm meal, a bandaged wound, the sound of laughter in the distance. In that quiet rehabilitation lay a paradox. Mercy was doing what warfare never could, breaking through indoctrination. For the first time, some Japanese prisoners began to write again. In their letters home, heavily censored but preserved in archives, they spoke of confusion more than fear. The Americans, one wrote, are strange. They treat us as men. It was not kindness that shocked them most. It was equality. To understand the disbelief of these men, one must understand what capture meant in the Japanese cultural framework. In traditional Bushido, surrender was not merely defeat. It was the collapse of one's soul. Families of POWs were often shunned, their names erased from temple records. A soldier taken alive was presumed dead in spirit. Even as these prisoners stood under American showers washing away the grime of Saipan or Guam, they were certain they could never return home as men. Their cleansing to them was not redemption. It was ritual humiliation. When American guards handed out clean uniforms, many refused to wear them, insisting on repairing their tattered Japanese ones instead. These are the clothes of the dead, one reportedly said, and I am already dead. In Japanese newspapers of the time, the government reinforced this belief. Official propaganda declared that captured soldiers were traitors to the emperor. Their families received notice that their sons had fallen honorably, with a Daishan truth that they lived under American care and was unthinkable. This cultural chasm was something the U.S. Army quickly learned to navigate. Interpreters and intelligence officers studied Japanese psychology, realizing that compassion alone was not enough. It had to be delivered without humiliation. Orders were issued: do not mock, do not taunt, do not speak of surrender. Even gestures of generosity were carefully managed. When showers were built at certain camps, guards were instructed to let prisoners bathe privately in small groups, preserving a sense of dignity. To the Americans, it was just procedure. To the Japanese, it was an incomprehensible act of respect from an enemy. Gradually, the stigma of survival began to weaken, at least inside the wire. The men who had believed themselves beyond redemption found, in the structure of their captors, a strange kind of order they could understand. And this shift, quiet, invisible, would have enormous consequences for intelligence gathering and post-war reconciliation. While compassion guided much of the U.S. approach, there was also a strategic layer to this system, one rooted in cold calculation. By 1944, American psychological warfare experts realized that humane treatment could yield more information than brutality ever would. A starving, terrified prisoner said nothing, but a fed, clean, and rested man, one who began to see his captors as human, might talk. Reports from the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, documented how the comfort of basic amenities, including showers, played a direct role in breaking emotional resistance. The first act of hygiene restores morale, one report noted. From there, speech follows. As prisoners regained physical strength, their mental guard weakened. They spoke of unit positions, supply shortages, and morale back home. The intelligence gathered from Japanese POWs helped shape American strategies in the final island campaigns and even informed occupation planning. At the same time, photographs of well-treated Japanese POWs began circulating in Allied propaganda, not just to show mercy, but to undermine Japan's myth of American barbarity. Leaflets dropped over Pacific Islands carried images of captured soldiers smiling, working in fields and writing letters. The message was simple: surrender, and you will live. To the Americans, this was the ultimate victory, using decency as disarmament. In this quiet war of perceptions, the shower became more than a hygiene tool. It was a psychological weapon, a symbol of civilization over fanaticism. For the Japanese prisoners, life behind the wire was a slow unraveling of everything they thought they knew. They had entered the camps expecting horror, execution, starvation, or forced labor until death. Instead, they found predictability, schedules, routines, a world ruled by order rather than chaos. Each morning began with roll call, breakfast, and then work assignments. Some in camp kitchens, others in nearby farms or workshops. To soldiers hardened by jungle starvation, a bowl of rice, bread, and coffee felt surreal. But the strangest moment came every few days. The shower. Steam rising from wooden walls, the hiss of water pipes, the faint scent of soap. These were luxuries even many American soldiers at the front didn't enjoy regularly. For the POWs, it was almost sacramental. Some stood motionless beneath the water, eyes closed, as if to confirm it was real. Others wept quietly, realizing they were being given care, not cruelty. This was not weakness on their part. It was confusion at mercy. For years, they had been told that Americans were demons who mutilated prisoners. The warmth of that water dissolved more than dirt. It washed away the lies of an empire. Camp officials noted visible changes. Prisoners began talking more, their posture relaxed. Smiles appeared. A few even asked for English lessons. Psychologists later called it the deconstruction of indoctrination. But it wasn't one-sided. The American guards, many of them young men who had lost friends to Japanese fire on islands like Tarawa or Leyte, were also changed. At first, hatred was strong, the enemy was faceless. Yet seeing those same devils quietly bow, clean their quarters, and thank them for food began to erode resentment. A sergeant at Camp Florence later recalled, "You start out watching them like hawks. Then one day you realize, yeah, they're just boys, same as us." This was the invisible front line, not of bullets, but of understanding. And it was being won quietly by soap, food, and structure. The efficiency of the American POW system was unlike anything seen before. By 1945, the United States was managing over 400,000 enemy prisoners of war, including Germans, Italians, and Japanese. Each was processed, documented, and integrated into a massive logistical network of camps, stretching from the Pacific coast to the Midwest. The Japanese population within that system was small, around 22,000, but unique. They required interpreters, cultural advisors, and special training for guards. Manuals were issued outlining cultural sensitivities. Avoid touching the head, a sign of insult. Discourage suicide attempts and encourage physical hygiene to maintain morale. Showers, medical inspections, and delousing routines weren't luxuries. They were policy. Cleanliness reduced disease and symbolized control, both over the body and over chaos. The OPMG also recognized the propaganda value of this organization. Visiting journalists and Red Cross observers were allowed to document camp conditions, recording scenes of Japanese POWs eating full meals, attending English classes, or working in agriculture. In one report, a Swiss observer wrote, "The treatment of Japanese prisoners in the United States appears consistent with international law and humane standards. They are perhaps surprised more than grateful." Inside the camps, rules were strict but fair. Punishment for infractions rarely involved physical harm. Isolation, loss of privileges, or duty reassignment were the main disciplinary tools. Many prisoners were even paid small wages for their labor, money they could spend at camp canteens on writing supplies or small treats. Letters to families, censored and translated, were often the most precious commodity. To write home was to reclaim identity. In every aspect, and from the plumbing to the paperwork, the U.S. POW system embodied a single message: civilization does not collapse in war. For Washington and the War Department, the humane treatment of POWs served a dual purpose: moral integrity and psychological warfare. On the surface, it was adherence to law, but beneath it was a deliberate contrast to the brutality of the Axis. News of Japanese atrocities in Nanking, Manila, and the Burma-Thailand Railway had filled American papers with horror. Against this backdrop, photographs of clean, healthy Japanese prisoners became powerful statements. We are not them. The Office of War Information produced pamphlets and broadcasts emphasizing this point, not to absolve American anger, but to affirm American values. Democracy does not torture, one script read. It conquers by strength and by decency. Even after Japan's surrender, these images continued to circulate. They played a key role during the early stages of occupation, when the U.S. sought to rebuild Japan not as a vanquished foe, but as a partner in peace. In Tokyo's shattered streets, the concept of surrender had been rewritten, not as eternal shame, but as the beginning of renewal. And much of that transformation began years earlier, in those quiet American camps where prisoners learned that mercy could be stronger than the sword. For the U.S., the moral victory was profound. In the Pacific, where cruelty had seemed endless, they had found a way to win without hatred. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had become a storm of steel and fire. The United States had broken Japan's outer defensive ring. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had turned into killing grounds, places where ideology met reality. When the fighting ended, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead, but among the bodies there were the living, a few hundred men, dazed and burned, clutching canteens and surrender flags fashioned from bandages. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Army had been defeated in full view of the world, and some of its soldiers had lived to tell of it. The Americans didn't know what to do with them at first. There were too few to justify permanent facilities on the front lines, and yet too valuable to discard. These men were the key to understanding the enemy's mind, and the heart of a new propaganda strategy. So they were shipped east, not home, not to the Philippines, but to the United States itself. The first group arrived in late 1944 under heavy guard. They disembarked in San Francisco under cover of night, far from civilian eyes. Reporters were forbidden to photograph them. The War Department feared public backlash if Americans saw Japanese soldiers treated too gently. From there, the prisoners were sent inland, by train, across a continent they had once been told was filled with savages. Through the slits of their rail car windows, they saw things they had never imagined. Vast plains, clean towns, farms stretching to the horizon. The war was far away here. The air smelled of wheat, not gunpowder. Their destination was Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and Camp Florence, Arizona, facilities designed to hold hundreds of Axis POWs under humane but secure conditions. It was in places like these that disbelief became transformation. At Camp Florence, the desert wind carried dust across miles of barbed wire. The Japanese prisoners stepped off the trucks still expecting beatings or starvation. Instead, they were met by orderly rows of barracks, an infirmary, and a kitchen where American soldiers were stirring soup. The processing was mechanical, almost polite. Identification numbers, fingerprints, medical checks. And then the unexpected command, bathhouse. The prisoners hesitated. Their commanders had told them that American showers were gas chambers. The rumor had circulated since the early days of the war, fed by wartime propaganda and fear, but the guards simply gestured again. The men walked forward. Steam drifted from the wooden sheds. One by one they stepped under the water. The shock of warmth broke them. Some cried, some laughed nervously. Others simply stood still, letting the dirt of the Pacific wash away, as if waking from a nightmare. Later, when interviewed by interpreters, several admitted they believed this kindness was a trick, that death would follow. But days passed and death never came. Instead, they received food, medicine, and routine. It was then that something irreversible began to shift. The U.S. guards watched with curiosity as prisoners, once mute and defiant, started bowing in gratitude after meals. The same men who had tried to claw their throats in suicide attempts now lined up for work assignments, learned English words, and even participated in music or theater programs organized by the camp staff. The transformation was not universal. Some remained withdrawn. Others clung to their indoctrination, but it was spreading. Reports from the Military Intelligence Service Language School. Missiles noted that Japanese morale stabilizes rapidly once discipline and hygiene are established. A simple shower, the report observed, often marked the turning point between suspicion and trust. The Americans realized they had stumbled upon an unexpected psychological truth. The restoration of dignity broke the will to resist. In one camp, a captured officer who had once commanded hundreds on Saipan confessed that he could no longer hate his captors. "They have taken away my reason for dying," he said quietly to an interpreter. "They have made me human again." For the guards, too, this was disorienting. Many had lost brothers in the Pacific. They had seen the photos of mutilated Marines on Tarawa, the reports of atrocities in Bataan, and yet here they were, watching their sworn enemies, once seen as inhuman, bathing, working, laughing. "It was like watching ghosts become men again," said one guard in a 1946 interview. Within months, the Japanese prisoners became some of the most disciplined groups within the entire U.S. POW system. They worked efficiently, kept order among themselves, and often impressed their overseers with loyalty and cleanliness. Behind the wire, they created gardens, shrines, and calligraphy clubs, small acts of culture that kept them connected to identity, even in captivity. But beneath this calm lay something deeper, a quiet crisis. If their captors were not the monsters they'd been told, then what had they been fighting for? By early 1945, Japan was fighting for its life. The home islands were under daily bombardment. Cities burned in the night skies. Entire divisions had vanished in the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima and the shattered hills of Okinawa. The Bushido Code, once a pillar of morale, had become a death sentence, and yet, within the boundaries of the United States, thousands of Japanese prisoners were living under an entirely different kind of order, one built not on fanaticism, but on structure, decency, and rules. Inside camps like McCoy, Florence, and Honolulu in Hawaii, the war's moral contradiction reached its peak. The same empire that demanded suicide as honor now watched its captured sons being allowed to live, and even thrive, under the flag of its enemy. As more prisoners arrived in 1945, this paradox deepened. Some came from Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Among them were civilians conscripted into the Imperial Army, teenagers, farmers, even old men. For them, the United States was supposed to be the realm of demons, but what they found instead was discipline wrapped in mercy. Each new arrival repeated the ritual of disbelief: registration, medical check, bath. The water ran warm. The guards said little. No one was beaten. No one was humiliated. It was, as one POW later described, the most confusing kindness imaginable. For the Americans running the camps, this calm exterior masked intense psychological work. Military intelligence officers, many trained at the MIS language school in Minnesota, interviewed prisoners daily. Their task was not to extract secrets by force, but to open minds through conversation. They asked about rations, morale, unit names, even songs the soldiers sang before battle. At first, the answers were stiff, but as weeks passed and showers, meals, and small freedoms became routine, the walls began to fall. An MIS officer later recalled, "Once they understood we would not kill them, they began to speak. They did not tell us what we wanted to hear. They told us what they needed to confess." Information flowed, not coerced, but released. Captured soldiers discussed conditions in their units, supply shortages, even hints of Japan's defensive strategies on Kyushu and Honshu. This intelligence shaped the U.S. military's planning for the invasion that never came, Operation Downfall, and helped analysts predict the near-total resistance that an invasion of Japan would have faced. But the transformation went beyond military value. Inside the camps, the concept of honor began to shift. At Camp McCoy, prisoners were encouraged to read newspapers, attend lectures, and even debate among themselves about Japan's future. American officers overseeing these programs didn't realize it then, but they were planting the seeds of post-war democracy. In the Arizona desert at Camp Florence, Japanese officers organized cultural evenings where poetry and calligraphy were shared, often in the presence of curious American guards. "The Americans watched us and they listened," wrote one POW in his diary. "They treated our words like they mattered. It was the first time in the war anyone had listened to us." Such experiences produced profound internal conflict. These men had been raised to believe that surrender was sin, that mercy was weakness. Yet here the enemy's mercy was unrelenting, structured and dignified. Some responded with shame, others with awakening. A few even began to question the ideology of the empire itself. In 1945, an intelligence report titled "Attitudes of Japanese POWs in the U.S." described a striking pattern. Many expressed confusion over the kindness of treatment. Several state that if their own government had treated them half as well, they would have fought to the end. That single sentence captured the essence of the psychological victory America had achieved, not through propaganda or coercion, but through the demonstration of an alternative moral order. Meanwhile, the contrast beyond the wire grew sharper. In Okinawa, entire Japanese units committed mass suicide rather than surrender. Civilians leapt from cliffs under the influence of imperial propaganda, and yet, news filtered through the POW network whispered from prisoner to prisoner that those who surrendered were not executed, but fed and sheltered. This rumor, quietly spreading through the ranks, began to erode the last myth of imperial invincibility. By August 1945, as Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned under atomic fire, and Emperor Hirohito prepared to speak the unthinkable words of surrender, some Japanese POWs in America gathered around camp radios. When they heard the Emperor's voice for the first time announcing the end of the war, many fell to their knees. Some wept openly. Others stared into the horizon in silence. For the guards, it was a strange sight, the enemy breaking down in peace, not in battle. A few days later, an officer at Camp Florence wrote in his logbook, "They did not cheer. They did not shout. They only asked if they would still be allowed to bathe tomorrow." In that simple question lay everything. fear, humility, and a fragile trust in a world that had somehow turned merciful. The war that began in fire had ended in quiet humanity, and behind the wire in the stillness of the desert night, both sides understood, perhaps for the first time, that victory was not only about who lived or died, but about who remained human. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's trembling voice carried through the radio waves of a ruined empire. For the first time in history, Japan had surrendered. Cities were ash and silence. Millions were displaced. Nearly 3 million soldiers would never come home, and among those who would return were a few thousand men, the invisible survivors, Japanese prisoners of war held across the Pacific and the American mainland. In the United States, their lives changed almost overnight. The camps, once buzzing with routine, became places of transition. American guards, now relieved of wartime tension, grew friendlier. Fences were less intimidating. There was music, mail, and even talk of repatriation. For many POWs, however, peace was terrifying. They had built fragile identities within the camps. Men who could laugh again, who could eat without shame, who had learned a few English words, who had learned that the enemy could be kind. Now they faced a different kind of fear, going home to a Japan that had condemned them for surrendering. When the first repatriation transports began in late 1945, they boarded quietly. Some bowed to their guards before leaving. Others left small gifts, carved wooden animals, painted calligraphy, origami cranes. One sergeant at Camp McCoy wrote, "They thanked us more than we ever thanked them." The ships carried them west across the same ocean they had once crossed to wage war, but now they returned as ghosts. Nameless, uncertain, unsure whether their families would even receive them. In Japan, the reality was crueler than they had feared. The government, seeking to preserve the image of national honor, treated repatriated POWs with suspicion. Their names were often omitted from war memorials. Many were questioned by military police, accused of collaboration or cowardice. Wives had remarried, believing them dead. Parents refused to speak their names aloud. A 1946 survey conducted by Japan's welfare ministry found that more than 60% of returned POWs were unemployed and socially isolated. Many concealed their status for decades, calling themselves war returnees instead of prisoners. One man later recalled, "In America, I was treated like a man. In Japan, I returned as a shadow." For some, the guilt was unbearable. Several took their own lives within months of returning home, unable to reconcile the kindness of their captors with the contempt of their countrymen. Others devoted themselves to silence, living ordinary lives while carrying the quiet memory of warmth, food, and water from a hand once called the enemy's. Yet not all were broken. A few found purpose in what they had witnessed. Among them were men who later became teachers, diplomats, or advocates for peace. They spoke not of defeat but of understanding, of a truth they had learned behind American fences, that strength without humanity is nothing. The American soldiers, too, were changed. Some who had guarded Japanese prisoners during the war later joined the post-war occupation in Japan. They walked the streets of Tokyo, now in ruins, and were recognized by former POWs who greeted them not with hatred, but gratitude. At Camp Florence, one guard wrote in his journal, "We fought a war with them, then we built showers for them. Maybe that's the only reason we won." The transformation was quiet, but it mattered. The humane treatment of Japanese POWs became a small but powerful seed in the soil of Japan's post-war recovery, proof that the enemy had seen them not just as soldiers, but as people. The U.S. Army's archives later recorded the program as a moral success. It had yielded valuable intelligence, yes, but it had also demonstrated that mercy itself could be a weapon of democracy. By 1946, the last major camps in the United States were closing. The barracks were dismantled, the showers drained, the fences rolled away. The desert wind reclaimed the sand. But in the memories of those who passed through, that warm water still fell, still cleansing something far deeper than dirt. The war's end brought a new kind of struggle. One fought not with rifles, but with ideas. For Japan, surrender was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual collapse. The emperor's divine authority had been broken. The code of death that had defined generations of warriors was suddenly meaningless. And into that void stepped something new. The lessons, visible and invisible, left by those who had seen the enemy's humanity firsthand. Among Japan's millions of returning soldiers were a few thousand men who had lived in American POW camps. They carried back stories that sounded at first like heresy. They spoke of clean beds and medical care, of American guards who shared cigarettes, of libraries, classrooms, and even showers. They told of discipline, fairness, and law, things that had survived the storm of war when everything else had collapsed. To a nation starved and defeated, These tales were almost incomprehensible, yet they mattered, because through them, the image of the American enemy began to change, not as an occupier or conqueror, but as a paradox, the victor who had shown restraint. During the early years of occupation, 1945-1952, U.S. officials noticed something unexpected. In interviews with Japanese communities, many citizens expressed surprise that the occupying troops were, in their words, just like those our sons described from the camps, polite, orderly, clean. That continuity of behavior, the consistent enforcement of humane discipline, became one of the quiet foundations of Japan's trust in its former enemy. Historians later traced parts of Japan's post-war democratic acceptance to this credibility. America had not just defeated Japan militarily, it had defeated the mythology of cruelty. Former POWs, though still stigmatized, began to write memoirs in the 1950s and 1960s. Their accounts were modest, factual, stripped of drama, yet the message was consistent. The Americans did not treat us as beasts, they treated us as men. One of the most influential voices was Kazuo Sakamaki, Japan's first captured soldier of World War II, taken after the failed attack on Pearl Harbor. His 1949 memoir, I Attacked Pearl Harbor, described his shock at being kept alive by the U.S. Navy. Though vilified in Japan for years, his story gradually became part of the nation's reckoning with its wartime ideology. Over time, silence turned to reflection. Schools began to teach not just about Japan's suffering, but about its moral missteps. The lesson was clear. Honor could exist without hatred. For the United States, the POW program became part of a larger narrative, the proof that democratic systems could hold their principles even in total war. In congressional reviews after 1946, the treatment of Japanese prisoners was cited as an example of the Geneva Convention's strength and the moral distinction between Allied and Axis conduct. The same logic would later guide the creation of humanitarian law during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, but beneath the paperwork and politics, the human echoes remained. In the Arizona desert, locals still remembered the polite Japanese men who had worked the fields during their captivity, men who bowed, smiled, and sent letters years later thanking them for kindness. In Wisconsin, veterans recalled the POWs who had played baseball on camp fields, waving to children beyond the fence. By the 1980s, when historians revisited the U.S. POW system, they found something rare in the archives of war, a story with no heroes, no villains, only humans rediscovering their own decency. One former Japanese prisoner, interviewed in 1984, was asked what had surprised him most about America. He paused and said simply, "The showers. We thought they would kill us. Instead, they cleaned us. That was the first time I realized the war was over. That memory, water falling, dirt fading, the sound of mercy, became a symbol far greater than its moment. It was proof that civilization could survive even amid destruction, and though fences and barracks vanished long ago, that moral contrast endures in the pages of history, a quiet reminder that victory measured by humanity lasts longer than any empire built by fear. The Pacific War was one of humanity's darkest storms, a conflict without mercy, fought in jungles and oceans where death seemed more certain than dawn. Yet somewhere between Saipan and Arizona, amid dust, barbed wire, and silence, a different kind of victory took shape. It was not written in medals or maps. It was written in soap and water, in the steam of a desert shower built for the enemy. For the Japanese prisoners, that moment was incomprehensible. They had been taught that Americans were beasts, that capture meant torment, that surrender was the death of the soul. And yet, when they were handed a towel instead of a bullet, the entire structure of hate collapsed. That small act, mechanical, procedural, almost ordinary, revealed the greatest power a nation can wield in war: the ability to remain human. America's POW camps were not perfect. They were born from war, surrounded by fences, guarded by men who had lost friends to Japanese fire. But inside those fences, something profound happened. Law triumphed over vengeance. The showers, the meals, the medical care, they were not luxuries. They were statements. They said, "We will not become what we fight."